While this time is beginning to feel more normal, we are in fact in a crisis. It's a time of uncertainty, and we're all wondering how we should be managing and responding. Our first guest, Alain Sylvain, argues we should be using this time carefully and thoughtfully to actively shape what will be a changed world. Throughout history, he suggests times of crisis have led to new ways of thinking and a deeper sense of purpose. In this talk, he'll speak about how a renewed sense of purpose leads to progress and how we can all tap into that natural instinct. Alain Sylvain is the founder and CEO of Sylvain Labs, a strategy and design consultancy that helps companies ranging from Google to Spotify to BlackRock maximize their potential. Sylvain Labs is also a certified B Corporation. Please join me in welcoming Alain Sylvain.
Today I'm going to talk about the progress instinct, how when we activate our human instinct to move things forward, we can actually trigger progress. I work at a place called Sylvain Labs, and actually we view ourselves as agents of progress. And we really aim to move society forward, move businesses forward through strategy and design. We work primarily in product innovation and brand strategy. And we do that across a lot of different categories and a lot of different businesses. We work in technology, we work in food and beverage, we work in media, we work in entertainment. And again, the objective really is to move society forward. A lot of our clients ask us this very basic question: what will the new normal be? A lot of clients are sort of in this mode of paralysis, and they want to know, how are consumers going to adapt and react to the crisis that we're in? But we sometimes can't help ourselves and ask the basic question: how will we create the new normal? Don't we have some agency to create what normalcy will be? But first, a quick recap. It started, of course, at the end of last year when the coronavirus came and hit the world really, really hard. And it was a fearful time. We didn't know what to do. And the consequence was tremendous, starting, of course, with the sheer death and the casualty of hundreds of thousands of people around the world who, of course, perished, followed by an economic response where we saw jobless claims around the world reach an all-time high, businesses halted, and they're still halted to a great degree. Meanwhile, society, especially here in the United States, was reckoning with a preceding pandemic, and that was, of course, systemic racism, starting with the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, followed by the killing of Breonna Taylor, followed by the gruesome footage of the killing of George Floyd. The response was tremendous, and we really saw this pandemic within a pandemic. And of course, activists were activated around the world, starting in the United States, responding to the federal response, responding to local government. And then what was crazy is that you saw that same response around the world. And this really spoke to the human crisis that we were in, that this is actually a crisis of humanity. And so we were hit by crisis after crisis after crisis in the first half of 2020. And I would argue that we're about to begin a whole new crisis in thinking about the election that's looming, where there's a new polarized political climate and no one really knows what's going to happen. That in itself is a third intense crisis that we're going to experience here in 2020. So what do we do? What do we do as we live in this contemporary time? It's important to take a step back and realize this is not the first time humans have encountered crisis of an unbelievable scale. By no means. 2020 is scary and it freaks us out. But if you look back over generations, over recorded history, you'll see there have been other pandemics. There have been other kind of political crises. There's been social unrest. It's part of the human condition, actually, crises, whether you're talking about 9/11 or the Great Depression or other pandemics. It's just part of how things go. So I want to tell the story of how humans have coped with crises, and I want to tell that through three stories. The first is the story of Viktor Frankl. He was a neuroscientist in Vienna, and he was born in 1904 and was a prolific neurological expert in that city. And he, in particular, what was interesting about him is he was the only and leading Jewish doctor that studied the brain in Vienna at the height of World War II. And he led the neurological department in Vienna at the Jewish hospital there. And of course, his family were the victims of the Holocaust. And he was sent to 4 different concentration camps with his family. Now, what makes him interesting beyond that is that in that very moment, in that kind of crisis moment, he did his most prolific and interesting work. He studied human suffering, he studied progress, he studied resilience, he studied survival, and he was one of the first people to really put words to it and talked about our purpose as human beings, that when we have a purpose to live, were more likely to survive and be more resilient. And he of course, did this at the height of the Holocaust, which is in itself incredible. He's famous for saying this: "Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose." He ended up, of course, being liberated from the death camps and became, again, a prolific academic. He wrote this book, Man's Search for Meaning, which has been translated in 25 different languages. It's in the Library of Congress. And it's really the beginnings of this idea of positive psychology and this idea of purpose. We talk about purpose like crazy here in 2020, and it begins with this moment at the height of World War II. To me, it's a miracle. It's a miracle that in this intense pressure and stress, this kind of theory was developed. And so Viktor Frankl is a great example of responding to crises. He ended up becoming a very successful academic and traveling the world and so on. Another example to think about is the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, not only did it hit everyday American citizens very, very hard, but it's an interesting context to think about how businesses respond to crises. Procter & Gamble at the time was run by a man named Richard Dupree. Richard Dupree was the only president of Procter & Gamble whose last name wasn't Procter or Gamble. So he had a lot on his plate, a lot on his shoulders. You know, how do you move this company forward at a time when Americans lost all of their disposable income? And so, you know, charged with really driving the growth of many of their products, one of them being this one product, Oxydol, you know, he had to be creative, and the company had to be creative in the height of this kind of critical crisis. And they saw this fledgling technology in radio. And they had this idea, you know, what if we use radio to reach our kind of core audience, which of course at the time were stay-at-home wives, who were a captive audience. And they felt like that was an interesting place, for the first time, an interesting place to deliver messages. And they had the ingenuity to create this show called Ma Perkins. It was about this eccentric woman in the backwoods who would give advice to these young kids who would come stay with her and so on. It ended up running for 27 years. And in those shows, they would drop references, what we now call commercials, to Oxydol. This was the first example of what we now know of as branded content. Or better said, this is the first example of the soap opera. And in fact, this is why soap operas are called soap operas, because they were brought to you by soap companies. And so to me, this is incredible. It ended up really pushing Procter & Gamble at the forefront. And the reason we know P&G today is because of moments like these. So that was in ingenuity and creativity when it comes to business. But there's also a story of pop culture here. That was the beginning of soap operas, if you think about it. And soap operas for decades have been just an important part of pop culture and have traveled the world, where you think about Nollywood or you think about telenovelas. So, the idea of P&G Productions is interesting. One more example, just to talk about how humans have the power to persevere in the face of crisis. Late 1970s in New York City. The city was on the verge of bankruptcy. Gerald Ford famously said to New York, "Drop dead." New York felt the effects of a really intense economic time. You saw a white flight, a lot of white families leaving the cities, leaving a lot of the economic situation to be very, very dangerous and scary for those that were left behind, black and brown people. You saw urban blight, a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of fires, crime, of course, increased. And so it's interesting. In the South Bronx, a few people came together, and as a response to what was happening, as a response to the intense critical moment, they had the foresight. Someone grabbed a record, looped an interesting soul beat over and over again, looped it, just an interesting drum beat. They connected it with amps and microphones. Someone told a story over that drum beat. They told a story about the time, about the intense time. And by the way, that story rhymed. It was an incredible creative explosion that came from an intense New York moment. And that, of course, is the story of hip hop. That's the genesis of hip hop. Hip hop comes from a crisis, actually. And so when we think about the lasting impact of hip hop, the fact that it's a $250 billion industry that includes fashion and music and includes sports and includes Broadway shows, hip hop is born of crisis. So here we are in 2020, facing crisis after crisis after crisis. And while our clients are asking what the new normal should be, I can't help but think that that's just passively waiting for change. when this is a time when we should be proactively pushing for progress. What can we learn from Viktor Frankl? What can we learn from Richard Dupree and Procter & Gamble? What can we learn from the story of hip hop? How do we proactively push for progress? Usually when humans face crises, there's a natural biological response. Famously, it's called the survival instinct, where humans are drawn to fight or flee, and it's biological. Actually, there's your eyes dilate, you sweat, your heart rate increases, your heart just pumps like crazy. You get stressed, and your shoulders clench up. It's a normal human response to crisis, and we've all felt it. I felt it through 2020. Most interestingly, though, stress hijacks the brain. There's all this research that shows that all of the blood and all of the energy kind of flows to more habitual parts of the brain, where you are drawn to just react to things in sort of a rote way. And all the energy that you put into creativity and imagination is actually sacrificed. That's the survival instinct. If you look at history carefully, you also see that there's something else called a progress instinct, what we call a progress instinct. And that's really our human drive to move forward in the face of threat. It's another way to survive. It's when you get creative and you collaborate with others in new ways. Frederick Douglass said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. There's a whole philosophy of life that believes that progress needs struggle to be ignited. And it's through struggle that we are forced to imagine what's not there. And when you think about Martin Luther King, who famously imagined a world of equality, that world did not exist, and that only came from the intense, critical moment of the day. Or you think about the amazing feats that humankind has created, in ancient Egypt or around the world. These things were created because of the vision to see something that wasn't there. Our modern society actually is based on that. The evolution from agriculture to a more industrial place is about seeing and imagining the power of collaborating and imagining things that weren't there. A great example of this is JFK. At the height of the Cold War, at the height of fear in the United States, he looked out to the American public and said, "We choose to go to the moon. Not because it's easy, but because it's hard. We choose to be bold." That was incredible foresight to think we need humans on the moon. Like humans on the moon, that's amazing. That's an amazing thing to imagine, and it's an amazing thing to push and an agenda to push forward for the American public. And that was truly about seeing things that were not there. So we study history not to know the future, but to widen our horizons, to understand that our present situation is neither natural nor inevitable, and that we consequently have many more possibilities before us than we imagine. 2020, we have many more possibilities before us than we imagine. Let's think about how companies respond to crises. Harvard Business Review did this interesting study many years ago where they looked at the odds that companies will significantly outgrow their rivals after a recession. And they had all this segmentation of thinking about businesses, and they realized that the companies that are more progressive, the companies that deploy an optimal combination of defense and offense, in the height of a crisis are 37% more likely to outgrow their rivals after a recession, as opposed to companies that only made defensive moves in the moment of crisis. And a great example of that is the internet bubble bursting in the late 90s and early 2000s. That in a way was a crisis. I mean, it was absolutely a crisis. Stocks sunk, companies folded, fortunes were lost. It was this intense time where we thought, there was a new future ahead of us with technology, and it just completely exploded. And no industry felt that more than consumer electronics. A lot of businesses, Sony and BlackBerry and others, sort of hunkered down. They were sort of paralyzed by the moment, and they said, let's wait this out. Sony famously cut 11% of their workforce, 12% of their R&D expenditure, 23% of all capital expenditures. They just said, hold up, we're going to wait. This is intense. Meanwhile, Apple, another consumer electronics company, actually at the beginning of its comeback, spent 13% more in R&D expenditure. And Tim Cook has famously said that they invest during times of downturns. And they saw this as a moment to accelerate, to go forward at the height. And this is 2000, 2001. And that, of course, was the explosion of innovation that we saw from Apple, which of course is a cliche example. When you think about the Apple Store and iTunes and the iPad and the iPhone, all of those ingenious ideas that we give credit to Apple for today came from that bold moment of investing at the height of a crisis. So my question is, how will you progress in today's crisis? It's 2020. What will you do? And what can we learn from these stories and activate? And I think it begins with really getting an orientation of where we are in 2020 and getting a sense of where do we sit relative to others and what do consumers want at this time. And it makes me think actually of mapping. You know, the first time humans took a step back and decided to map civilization, that was an incredible moment when the humans realized, okay, the river is over there, a rival tribe is over there, and you had this bird's eye view of where we sat. And so let's take a bird's eye view. Let's take a bird's eye view on 2020 and what do consumers want and need today? We think of it as macro shifts. We think of it as like how behaviors are shifting from one thing to another. The first macro shift is this idea of reprioritized energy. Through our research, we're learning that consumers are taking a step back and they're reappraising the things around them and the way they spend their time. So people are actually spending more time communicating with others on digital platforms, but also, of course, in real life as much as possible. Their companies are giving space for their employees to spend time more consciously. This idea of like, my time is important and my life is important and these things aren't fleeting. That's a really interesting new shift and changes sort of the role companies and products can play in people's lives. The second shift we're seeing is this idea of collective care, where in the past, you might argue, consumers were a little bit more self-motivated. This idea of I will take care of my neighbor, I have a responsibility to take care of my neighbor, that's a new thing. That wasn't in 2019. And you see that, you know, stores opening early for older populations, or of course the entire notion of activism, social activism, is about caring for the collective. Another example, another shift that we're seeing is mainstream activism, and this one is probably obvious. But the idea, especially when you look at Generation Z, this idea that I have something to say and I need to do something, I need to respond to the climate, the social climate, and I can do something about it. And the fact that activism is just, you know, as simple as a hashtag sometimes, activism has actually become mainstream, where activism used to be on the margins and it was inherently outside the mainstream, but now activism is mainstream. The fourth thing we're seeing is transparency. So companies and businesses and media companies are spending much more energy to be candid and truthful and fact-oriented. Whether we see it in politics or not, you know, who knows? But companies are actually being much more open about what goes into their products and the stories behind them. And you see that beautifully designed sometimes in the New York Times. And the fifth macro shift we're seeing is this idea of mindful checkups. Society has sort of finally reckoned with the truth of mental health and mental well-being. And so you're seeing products popping up that address this. You're also seeing big companies that you would think would never address it, actually talking very openly about checking in with yourself and thinking about your mental health and your social well-being. So those are the 5 macro shifts we think impact this kind of critical moment of crisis. Reprioritize energy, collective care, mainstream activism, transparency, and mindful checkups. So thinking about that, my question is, how will you progress in 2020? How will you progress in the face of threat and stress? Hopefully, we can all do it through the progress instinct. Thanks.